I'm glad you're here tonight. Before we wander onto an old road that has long since disappeared beneath fields, forests, and modern highways, let me ask a simple question. How are you doing? Perhaps today asked a little too much of you. Maybe your mind is still sorting through unfinished work conversations that linger longer than they should, or the endless list of things waiting for tomorrow. It seems every generation believes its worries are uniquely exhausting, yet people have always carried invisible burdens. The difference is that most of us travel with smartphones and charging cables, while our medieval companions often carried something infinitely stranger, folded at the bottom of a leather satchel. So, if you can allow your shoulders to sink, just a little, let your jaw soften. Let your breathing become slower than your thoughts. Tonight, there is nowhere to hurry. We are simply following an ordinary traveler preparing to leave home, and tucked among his belongings is an object that seems impossible to modern eyes, the cloth in which he expects strangers might one day bury him. The first sounds of morning in a 13th century market town were rarely dramatic. No triumphant trumpet announced another ordinary Tuesday. Instead, the day unfolded through familiar rhythms that almost every resident could recognize without opening their eyes. A rooster somewhere beyond the timber fences protested the darkness as though dawn itself required encouragement. A baker had already begun feeding a fire that smelled faintly of oak and yesterday's ashes. A horse shifted impatiently against its tether, while somewhere a wooden shutter creaked open to admit the first pale light into a room still scented with smoke from the previous evening's hearth. Inside one modest house, a young merchant prepared for departure. He had completed this ritual many times before, though every journey carried its own uncertainty. His leather satchel already held dried bread, smoked cheese wrapped in cloth, a small knife, wax tablets for recording transactions, several carefully counted silver pennies, and a pair of extra wool stockings that his mother insisted would become useful even if he laughed at the suggestion. She watched him with the practiced calm of someone who had witnessed many departures. Her movements lacked the frantic anxiety one might expect from modern parents sending a child into danger. Instead, they possessed the deliberate rhythm of habit, almost ceremony. From a wooden chest beneath the bed, she withdrew a folded rectangle of white linen. It was neither embroidered nor luxurious. Its value rested entirely in its simplicity. She placed it carefully beside his satchel. The merchant did not appear surprised. Neither of them needed to explain why it belonged there. To modern observers, this moment feels almost impossible to understand. We associate travel with optimism. Vacations begin with luggage wheels rolling through airports and cheerful photographs taken before departure. Even business trips assume arrival. Death belongs somewhere far beyond the itinerary. For many medieval travelers, however, death occupied no such distant position. It walked quietly beside every road, every bridge, every mountain pass, every river crossing, never demanding constant attention, yet never disappearing entirely from awareness. This difference was not necessarily evidence that medieval Europeans were more pessimistic than we are. In some respects, they may have been more practical. They inhabited a world where mortality rarely disguised itself behind statistics or hospital walls. It appeared openly in village churchyards, family homes, monasteries, and market squares. Children grew up recognizing funeral bells as naturally as they recognized the changing seasons. The folded linen resting beside the merchant's belongings did not represent surrender. It represented preparation. Preparation occupied an astonishingly large portion of medieval life. Farmers prepared for failed harvests by storing grain whenever possible. Housewives salted meat months before winter. Monasteries copied manuscripts because ink faded and parchment decayed. Craftsmen maintained tools long before they actually broke. Preparing for death during travel followed exactly the same logic. After all, roads themselves could not be trusted. Modern maps encourage the illusion that destinations remain fixed and dependable. Distances appear measurable. Routes seem guaranteed. Medieval roads behaved rather differently. Many were little more than widened footpaths, gradually shaped by centuries of feet hooves and wagon wheels. Heavy rain transformed them into rivers of mud. Winter froze them into uneven ridges capable of breaking cart axles. Summer drought covered travelers with clouds of dust that settled into every fold of clothing. Even apparently successful journeys contained hidden dangers, invisible to anyone leaving home. Bridges occasionally collapsed. River ferries overturned. Pack animals stumbled. Forests concealed opportunistic thieves. Illness emerged without warning. A healthy traveler could begin the morning bargaining cheerfully over wool prices and finish the evening unable to stand because contaminated water had introduced dysentery into an already exhausted body. Unlike dramatic battlefield deaths celebrated in epic poems, most medieval deaths occurred with remarkable ordinariness. Historians examining burial records repeatedly encounter this quiet reality. While chronicles devoted enormous attention to kings' crusades and spectacular disasters, ordinary administrative documents tell a gentler, more repetitive story. Parish registers, monastery necrologies, and local obituary lists frequently describe travelers who simply failed to complete their journeys. Sometimes the cause remained unknown. Sometimes it was fever. Sometimes exposure. Sometimes an accident. Occasionally the record merely observed that an unknown traveler had died near the village boundary and received Christian burial through local charity. That final phrase mattered enormously. Christian burial represented far more than respectful disposal of the body. Medieval theology invested extraordinary significance in the treatment of the dead. Although beliefs varied across regions and centuries, most ordinary Christians hoped their bodies would receive proper preparation prayers and burial in consecrated ground. These practices reflected confidence in eventual resurrection and participation within the wider Christian community, extending beyond death itself. To be denied such rights was deeply unsettling. The fear was not simply physical neglect. It concerned spiritual belonging. Ironically, many modern audiences imagine medieval Europeans spending every waking hour terrified of divine punishment. The surviving evidence paints something subtler. Most villagers certainly accepted religious teaching seriously, yet daily life remained filled with practical concerns involving crops, taxes, marriages, weather, and livestock. Religion shaped ordinary routines rather than interrupting them. Preparing a burial cloth fit naturally into that larger pattern. The linen itself served several practical functions. First, it allowed anyone discovering the deceased to wrap the body respectfully before transport. Second, clean linen reduced direct exposure during preparation. Third, it demonstrated that the traveler had anticipated Christian burial rather than abandonment. Finally, it spared strangers the expense and difficulty of locating suitable cloth in unfamiliar villages where resources might already be limited. Its simplicity concealed remarkable social generosity. Imagine discovering an unknown traveler beside a woodland road. You know nothing about his family. You cannot identify his village. Yet inside his satchel lies everything necessary to begin treating him with dignity, rather than creating additional burdens. He had quietly assisted those who would eventually care for him. This practical kindness often disappears beneath modern assumptions about medieval brutality. Certainly violence existed. So did disease. So did hardship. Yet alongside these realities operated an equally persistent expectation that strangers deserved assistance whenever circumstances allowed. Monasteries preserved numerous accounts emphasizing hospitality toward travelers precisely because roads remained dangerous. The Rule of Saint Benedict. One of medieval Europe's most influential monastic texts instructed communities to receive guests as though welcoming Christ himself. Although actual practice varied widely depending upon local resources, this principle profoundly influenced attitudes toward hospitality throughout Christian Europe. Travelers understood something equally important. Help depended upon reputation. A respectful traveler who behaved honorably increased the likelihood of receiving food, shelter, and assistance from unfamiliar communities. Carrying one's own burial cloth formed part of that broader culture of responsibility. It quietly communicated foresight, humility, and consideration for others. Not everyone, of course, could afford identical preparations. Linen itself represented valuable labor. Producing it required cultivating flax harvesting stems, soaking them through, retting, breaking fibers, combing strands, spinning thread, weaving cloth, then bleaching, or washing the finished fabric. Every stage demanded time, measured not in hours, but in weeks and months. Consequently, burial cloths varied significantly. Wealthier merchants sometimes traveled with finer linen. Students might carry smaller pieces. Pilgrims often relied upon simpler fabric acquired through charity or local production. Yet the underlying principle remained astonishingly consistent across social classes. One prepared. Preparation reflected wisdom. A medieval proverb surviving in several regional variations expressed this attitude succinctly. Today's careful traveler saves tomorrow's mourners. Whether every village actually quoted those exact words matters less than the mentality they reveal. Preparation protected not only oneself, but everyone else, drawn into one's fate. Meanwhile, our young merchant finished fastening his satchel. Outside, neighbors began gathering wagons destined for nearby fairs. Oxen snorted clouds into the cool morning air. Women exchanged news while balancing baskets filled with onions, turnips, and coarse bread. Children chased each other between wooden barrels, largely indifferent to adults discussing market prices. Life continued with astonishing normality. No dramatic farewell unfolded. His mother adjusted the clasp, securing his cloak against expected rain. She briefly touched his shoulder. Neither embraced for long. They both understood departures as ordinary events. Perhaps that familiarity surprises us most. Modern storytelling frequently portrays medieval families either drowning in emotion or entirely incapable of expressing affection. Real life occupied the quieter middle ground. Affection often appeared through practical acts rather than elaborate speeches. Packing extra stockings, sharpening a knife, repairing worn boots, adding one folded burial shroud. Love sometimes looked remarkably ordinary. As he stepped into the street, church bells announced morning prayers across the town. Their sound floated above tiled roofs and timber chimneys, before dissolving into distant fields, waiting beyond the village boundary. Ahead stretched roads connecting hundreds of communities whose inhabitants would never know his name. Some would sell him meals. Others would offer directions. Perhaps a monastery would provide lodging. Perhaps storms would delay him. Perhaps thieves would ignore him entirely. No one, including the merchant himself, could predict precisely which version of the journey awaited. Yet somewhere beneath bread-clothing coins and commercial records rested the neatly folded linen, not because he intended to use it, not because he expected misfortune, but because countless travelers before him had quietly accepted one of medieval Europe's least discussed truths. The road belonged equally to the living, the weary, the hopeful, and occasionally to those whose final destination would be reached by strangers carrying them the last few miles. The merchant had traveled long enough to recognize that every road possessed its own personality. A route might appear harmless when traced across a map copied by a monastery scribe, yet parchment never captured the way morning mist lingered over marshes, how wagon wheels carved deep grooves into clay after autumn rain, or how the silence beneath ancient oaks sometimes felt almost inhabited. Medieval roads were not engineered corridors separating one destination from another. They were living spaces where countless individual stories briefly crossed before vanishing forever. By late afternoon, the market town had disappeared behind gently rolling hills, its church tower no longer visible above the trees. Ahead stretched a broad forest road that generations of merchants, pilgrims, scholars, wandering craftsmen, and humble laborers, had followed for centuries. The path itself was hardly more than 2 parallel tracks worn into the earth by cartwheels. Grass grew stubbornly between them, and exposed tree roots forced horses to choose each step carefully. No signposts marked the way. Knowledge of direction lived instead inside memory, conversation, and habit. The merchant noticed several travelers already resting beside a shallow stream where the road widened enough for carts to pass. They had arranged themselves without formal planning, each person instinctively respecting enough distance to preserve privacy, while remaining close enough that conversation flowed easily. Medieval travel often produced these temporary communities. People who had never met before might share only an hour together before continuing toward entirely different futures. Yet during that brief pause, they exchanged information as valuable as any coin. An elderly pilgrim sat upon a fallen log, repairing the leather strap of his satchel with practiced fingers. His cloak displayed the unmistakable signs of long travel. Dust had settled permanently into its wool, while countless careful stitches revealed years of patient maintenance rather than neglect. Beside him rested a younger apprentice, whose expression still carried the eager confidence of someone for whom the world remained largely theoretical. The apprentice glanced curiously as the merchant loosened his satchel to retrieve bread. Among the neatly folded belongings, he noticed a square of white linen. "You carry one as well," the young man remarked quietly. The merchant smiled. "So does almost everyone who has traveled long enough." The apprentice frowned. "My father said only pilgrims needed burial cloths." Before the merchant could answer, the older pilgrim chuckled softly. "Your father has probably never crossed 3 dioceses in the same month." His humor contained no cruelty. Like many experienced travelers, he understood that nearly every beginner asked the same questions eventually. The apprentice leaned forward. "I still don't understand. Doesn't carrying such a thing invite bad fortune?" The older man finished tying the repaired strap before answering. "No more than carrying an extra horseshoe invites your horse to lose one." It was the sort of reply medieval teachers often favored. Rather than confronting fear directly, they gently redirected attention toward practical reasoning. Preparation and expectation were not identical. This distinction mattered enormously throughout medieval society. Modern psychology frequently distinguishes between anxiety and preparedness. Yet medieval communities often arrived at remarkably similar conclusions through entirely different language. Preparing for misfortune did not necessarily indicate obsession with disaster. Instead, it reflected recognition that uncertainty formed part of ordinary existence. Farmers stored grain because winter always arrived. Fishermen repaired nets because ropes eventually frayed. Travelers packed burial cloths because roads sometimes claimed lives. None of these actions required constant fear, only experience. The apprentice remained unconvinced. But surely, he hesitated, lowering his voice instinctively. "Surely carrying something meant for death reminds God that you are ready." The pilgrim laughed again, this time warmly enough that even nearby strangers smiled without entirely knowing why. "My young friend," he replied, "God hardly needs reminders." Several listeners nodded almost imperceptibly. Such exchanges occurred far more frequently than surviving literature suggests. While medieval theological debates often appear intimidating in manuscripts copied by educated clerics, ordinary conversations usually relied upon practical analogies, understandable to farmers, merchants, and craftsmen alike. Religion lived through familiar examples. The merchant unfolded his meal, while the older traveler continued speaking. "When I first left home," the pilgrim admitted, "I thought much the same as you." "You were afraid." "I was proud." The apprentice looked surprised. "Proud? I believed death belonged to old men. I carried good boots, good food, and enough confidence for 3 travelers. I thought confidence itself might frighten danger away." He paused, just long enough for irony to settle comfortably between them. "It did not." The surrounding travelers listened politely without interrupting. Roadside conversations often served educational purposes, extending well beyond entertainment. Experienced travelers possessed knowledge unavailable inside village boundaries. They knew which rivers flooded unexpectedly, which inns remained honest, which mountain passes still held snow late into spring, and which customs differed dramatically once another lord's territory began. Knowledge itself became a form of shared charity. One merchant described changing toll rates. Another warned of bridge repairs several miles ahead. A woman traveling toward a nearby monastery explained where fresh wells could still be found despite recent drought. This constant exchange of information dramatically increased survival. Historians sometimes describe medieval roads primarily through violence and robbery, but contemporary evidence paints a more balanced picture. Certainly danger existed. Court records document highway thefts. Royal proclamations occasionally ordered forests cleared beside major roads to reduce ambushes. Chronicles mention notorious bands of criminals. Yet these same sources also reveal something else. Most journeys succeeded. If every road had truly resembled modern fiction, long-distance trade could scarcely have existed. Instead, survival depended largely upon cooperation among strangers. The folded burial cloth represented one visible expression of that cooperation. The apprentice slowly turned the idea over in his mind. So if someone dies, others already know what should be done, the merchant finished. The older pilgrim nodded approvingly. Exactly. He reached into his own satchel and withdrew his linen bundle. Unlike the merchant's cloth, this one displayed careful repairs, stitched over many years. I have carried this across France, Burgundy, the Rhineland, and northern Italy. You've never needed it. I hope I never shall. Then why keep the same one? The old man smiled almost mischievously. Because every journey I finish reminds me that I prepared wisely. There existed remarkable psychological comfort in preparedness itself. Modern researchers studying disaster planning occasionally observe similar patterns. Individuals who quietly prepare emergency supplies often experience less daily anxiety than those refusing even to consider unlikely events. Preparation reduces uncertainty. Medieval travelers understood this intuitively. The burial cloth became less an omen than reassurance. Should the worst occur, one essential task had already been completed. This seemingly small detail also reflected broader Christian ideas concerning charity. Across much of medieval Europe, caring for unknown travelers ranked among the recognized works of mercy. Monasteries frequently maintained guest halls, precisely because strangers lacked local family support. Urban confraternities sometimes organized assistance for impoverished pilgrims. Parish communities collected alms to aid travelers unable to continue because of illness. Hospitality formed an invisible infrastructure stretching across the continent. Not perfect, not universal, certainly not equally generous everywhere, yet astonishingly widespread. Surviving monastic account books occasionally include expenditures for linen candles, burial expenses, or food specifically allocated to travelers. These dry financial entries rarely attract popular attention, compared with illuminated manuscripts or royal chronicles, yet they quietly reveal an everyday reality. Communities expected strangers to appear, sometimes alive, occasionally dead. Either way, preparations existed. As shadows lengthened beneath the trees, the travelers resumed walking together almost without discussion. Shared movement naturally emerged because numbers provided comfort. Wolves generally avoided groups. Thieves preferred isolated victims whenever possible. Conversation also shortened perceived distance. The apprentice now walked beside the elderly pilgrim rather than behind him. "You've seen many deaths," the older man answered after thoughtful silence. Enough to stop counting. The words sounded neither tragic nor boastful, merely factual. What was it like? Usually quieter than people imagine. That answer might surprise modern audiences accustomed to dramatic portrayals of medieval mortality. Literature often emphasizes heroic last speeches or terrifying plagues, sweeping entire regions. Ordinary deaths looked rather different. An exhausted traveler failing to wake, a fever worsening overnight, a fall from a frightened horse, an infection following a minor cut. History often advances through kings. Individual lives usually end through ordinary causes. The pilgrim continued, "What stays with you isn't death itself. What is it? The kindness afterward." The apprentice frowned slightly. "The kindness. I've watched strangers dig graves for people whose names they never learned." The merchant glanced sideways. He too had witnessed similar scenes. Roadside burials occasionally became unexpectedly communal affairs. Nearby villagers passing merchants, monks, or fellow pilgrims temporarily united around shared responsibility before continuing separate lives. Their cooperation rarely appeared inside famous chronicles, because nothing politically important occurred. No kingdom changed hands. No battle was fought. No cathedral was built. Simply a group of ordinary people refusing to abandon another human being. Ironically, such moments may reveal medieval society more accurately than many celebrated historical events. A 15th century traveler might forget the price of wool sold in one town. He rarely forgot unexpected kindness received far from home. As evening approached, distant church bells drifted faintly across the forest, almost swallowed by wind, moving gently through the leaves. The sound reminded every traveler that somewhere ahead, another settlement waited. Another guest house, another meal, another chance encounter, another night survived. And beneath nearly every satchel wrapped carefully among bread, clothing, prayer books, and merchant accounts, the quiet rectangle of folded linen continued traveling with them, not as a symbol of despair, but as one more practical companion on roads, where wisdom so often meant preparing for tomorrow, without surrendering today's hope. The monastery emerged gradually, rather than dramatically, almost as though the surrounding hills had decided after centuries of quiet contemplation to shape themselves into stone walls. Travelers first noticed the bell tower rising above the trees, then the pale limestone reflecting the last amber light of evening, and finally, the orderly gardens stretching beyond the outer buildings. Unlike castles, which often announced authority through height and intimidation, monasteries frequently communicated stability through rhythm. Everything appeared arranged according to habits repeated so many times that even the buildings seemed to breathe in measured intervals. By the time the weary travelers reached the guest house gate, the day's heat had softened into the cool dampness that settled over much of northern Europe after sunset. Their boots carried the familiar mixture of dust, mud, and crushed leaves, accumulated from dozens of miles on uneven roads. Shoulders sagged. Conversation slowed. Even the apprentice, whose enthusiasm had survived most of the journey, now looked more interested in a wooden bench than in another lesson. A lay brother greeted them before they reached the doorway. His welcome contained neither excessive excitement nor suspicious hesitation. He simply nodded, asked where they had come from, whether anyone required medical attention, and how many beds would be needed for the night. Such questions reflected practical necessity rather than curiosity. Monasteries along important travel routes received enough strangers that hospitality had become almost administrative. The kindly monk responsible for the guest house appeared moments later, carrying a lantern whose warm glow pushed gently against the gathering darkness. His eyes moved quietly across each traveler. Experienced hosts develop remarkable observational skills. They noticed limps before complaints, fatigue before collapse, illness before fever fully declared itself. When his attention settled briefly upon the folded linen protruding from the elderly pilgrim's satchel, his expression changed only slightly. Not surprise, recognition. Another prepared traveler. Another ordinary journey. Another familiar custom. Modern visitors sometimes imagine monasteries as isolated worlds disconnected from everyday society. In reality, many religious communities functioned as vital crossroads through which news, commerce, education, and countless human stories continually passed. Pilgrims carried rumors from distant kingdoms. Merchants discussed changing markets. Students traveling between cathedral schools exchanged ideas alongside bread and ale. Wandering craftsmen described new building techniques learned hundreds of miles away. Monasteries became repositories not only of books, but also of conversations. Every guest left behind something intangible. Every arrival expanded the community's understanding of the wider world. Inside the guest hall, long wooden tables already held simple evening meals. Thick barley bread, vegetable pottage, small portions of cheese onions, and weak ale awaited those fortunate enough to arrive before darkness made further travel unwise. The apprentice accepted his bowl with visible gratitude. "I'd imagined monasteries much quieter," he admitted. The elderly pilgrim smiled. "They become quieter after everyone has finished asking for more bread." Even the monk allowed himself a brief smile. Dry humor rarely disappeared behind monastery walls. Although modern imagination often paints medieval religious life in solemn colors, surviving letters and anecdotes reveal communities populated by thoroughly human personalities. Monks complained about cold winters, poor wine, lazy brothers, difficult abbots, and occasionally mischievous cats stealing fish intended for fasting days. Holiness did not eliminate ordinary conversation. It merely framed it differently. As the meal progressed, the monk eventually sat beside the travelers. "You have come from the western road." The merchant nodded. "And tomorrow?" "Toward the river crossings." The monk's brow tightened almost imperceptibly. "Travel carefully. One bridge remains damaged after spring flooding." Such practical advice formed another overlooked dimension of medieval hospitality. Guest houses did not merely offer beds. They transmitted information accumulated from dozens of travelers passing through each week. In many ways, they resembled living maps whose knowledge updated continuously through conversation rather than ink. The apprentice hesitated before asking the question that had occupied his thoughts all afternoon. "Brother?" "Yes." "Do many travelers carry burial cloths?" The monk answered without hesitation. "Enough that I notice when one does not." Silence briefly settled around the table. The apprentice looked genuinely astonished. "So common, so sensible." The monk reached toward a nearby shelf where several carefully folded pieces of linen rested beside candles and simple medical supplies. "We keep extra cloth as well." The apprentice glanced between the shelf and the travelers. "In case someone forgets. In case someone never expected the journey to become their last." His voice remained calm, not melancholy, simply matter-of-fact. That calmness reflected one of medieval Christianity's most distinctive attitudes toward mortality. Death certainly inspired grief, fear, and uncertainty. Yet religious teaching also encouraged continual preparation rather than denial. Sermons frequently reminded congregations that life remained uncertain while simultaneously urging them to live responsibly instead of anxiously. The ideal Christian prepared spiritually and practically. Neither preparation canceled hope. Archaeological discoveries reinforce this remarkably balanced perspective. Excavations at medieval hospitals, monasteries, and pilgrimage centers repeatedly uncover evidence of organized care rather than chaotic desperation. Burial grounds reveal individuals interred respectfully despite dying far from identifiable family. Clothing remnants, pilgrim badges, rosaries, and simple personal possessions occasionally accompany these graves, suggesting communities took genuine care, preserving personal identity whenever possible. History often remembers medieval Europe through epidemics and warfare. Its cemeteries quietly preserve countless acts of compassion. The monk continued. "Most people misunderstand readiness." "How so?" the apprentice asked. "They imagine readiness belongs only to soldiers." He paused thoughtfully before adding, "But every traveler practices readiness." He pointed gently toward the merchant. "You carry extra stockings?" The merchant nodded. "You carry wax for waterproofing leather?" Another nod. "You carry enough coins for unexpected tolls?" "Course." "And your burial cloth?" The monk folded his hands together. "One preparation differs only in subject, not in principle." The apprentice slowly lowered his eyes toward his own satchel. He had packed food, blankets, writing materials, money, no linen. For perhaps the first time since leaving home, he recognized preparation as something larger than packing efficiently. It reflected an entire philosophy. Outside, darkness settled completely across the monastery gardens, unlike modern landscapes, illuminated by electric light. Medieval night transformed familiar surroundings into something almost entirely different. Buildings disappeared into silhouettes. Paths dissolved beneath shadows. Sounds traveled farther than sight. Owls replaced merchants. Wind acquired personality. For many travelers, monasteries represented islands of light within vast oceans of darkness. This practical reality shaped religious symbolism in surprisingly literal ways. Candles mattered because darkness genuinely dominated. Hospitality mattered because roads genuinely isolated. Bells mattered because voices disappeared into forests. The elderly pilgrim eventually rose to stretch aching legs. The monk accompanied him toward the courtyard, where fresh evening air drifted through flowering herbs cultivated for medicine. Rows of lavender, sage, rosemary, and fennel released faint fragrances beneath cooling temperatures. "You've buried many travelers," the pilgrim observed quietly. The monk nodded. "I have prayed over enough. They trouble you. They remind me of death." "No." The monk looked upward where stars slowly emerged beyond the bell tower. "Of how dependent we all are upon strangers." Those words lingered. Modern societies often celebrate independence as personal achievement. Medieval life taught almost the opposite lesson. No farmer harvested entirely alone. No cathedral rose through individual effort. No merchant completed long journeys without assistance. Even death itself frequently required cooperation among people previously unknown to one another. Dependence carried surprisingly little shame. It simply described reality. One surviving English monastery account from the late 13th century records modest expenditures for burying unidentified travelers discovered near the abbey lands. The document offers almost frustratingly little drama. It lists cloth candles, labor, and prayers with the same careful precision used for repairing roofs or purchasing grain. To modern readers, its administrative tone can appear cold. Perhaps it was actually compassionate. Kindness had become routine enough to require bookkeeping. The monk eventually asked, "And your apprentice?" "He learns quickly. He fears the cloth. He fears what it suggests." The monk smiled gently. "Then perhaps tomorrow he will understand that it suggests life rather than death." That seemed almost paradoxical. Yet throughout medieval thought, preparation frequently affirmed life's value precisely because life remained fragile. One protected what mattered. One prepared because the journey deserved completion, not because failure was expected. Back inside the guest house, the apprentice already slept more peacefully than he had expected. His satchel rested beneath the bench where he would spend the night. Nearby lay the merchant's belongings, the elderly pilgrim's weathered pack, and dozens of possessions belonging to strangers, temporarily united beneath one roof. Each bundle contained different tools, different memories, different destinations. Some also contained folded linen awaiting a purpose everyone hoped would never arrive. The monastery itself settled into familiar nighttime rhythms. Footsteps softened, prayers concluded, lanterns dimmed one by one. Somewhere beyond thick stone walls, scribes continued copying manuscripts by candlelight, while gardeners prepared tomorrow's tasks and kitchen workers banked cooking fires beneath warm ash until dawn. The traveler slept surrounded not merely by architecture, but by an institution that had quietly connected Europe's roads for centuries. Tomorrow, they would continue onward. Some would reach home. Some would discover entirely new towns. Some friendships would end with sunrise. Others might last decades. None could know. Yet as sleep slowly claimed the guest house, the folded burial cloth beside each prepared traveler ceased looking like an object associated with endings. Instead, within those peaceful monastery walls, it resembled something unexpectedly hopeful. A quiet promise that wherever the road finally stopped, someone somewhere would remember that even a stranger deserved dignity, prayer, and the kindness of human hands. The afternoon had quietly surrendered to evening by the time the travelers finally saw the monastery rising above the trees. It did not appear suddenly like the castle celebrated in heroic tales, perched dramatically upon impossible cliffs. Instead, it emerged with almost embarrassing modesty, its pale stone walls slowly separating themselves from the mist until chimneys, gardens, bell tower, and wooden outbuildings revealed themselves one by one. After miles of forest mud, aching feet, suspicious crossroads, and endless conversations about whether the next stream contained clean water or future stomach misery. The sight of ordered buildings produced something that modern people might struggle to recognize. It was not excitement. It was relief so deep, it felt almost sacred. For centuries, monasteries formed one of the quiet foundations supporting European travel. Long before hotels advertised complimentary breakfasts or online reviews debated thread counts, monasteries maintained guest houses where strangers could rest under the protection of both religious obligation and practical necessity. Hospitality was not simply considered good manners. It was woven into Christian teaching itself. Scripture repeatedly reminded believers that welcoming strangers could become an encounter with Christ himself. Although the practical experience usually involved welcoming exhausted merchants whose boots had not encountered soap for several weeks. As the travelers crossed the outer gate, no one rushed to search their bags with suspicious efficiency. Instead, an elderly lay brother greeted them with practiced calm, asking where they had come from, whether anyone was injured, and whether they carried news from neighboring towns. Information traveled alongside people. Every traveler functioned as a walking newspaper. Before sleeping arrangements were discussed, local gossip often received equal attention. The young apprentice noticed something almost immediately. Near the entrance stood several wooden pegs where travelers hung cloaks to dry. Among them dangled numerous small linen bundles tied with careful knots. At first glance, they resembled spare clothing. Yet the experienced pilgrim beside him smiled knowingly. You've started noticing them. The burial cloths. Exactly. They're everywhere. They usually are. The apprentice looked around more carefully. One merchant carried his folded linen inside a leather satchel. Another pilgrim had wrapped it beneath his blanket roll. A widow traveling toward a shrine kept hers inside a woven basket beneath dried herbs and bread. None attempted to hide it. No one displayed it proudly either. It existed somewhere between ordinary luggage and private prayer. Objects sometimes disappear from history because they become too familiar to attract attention. Medieval inventories lovingly described silver goblets, jeweled reliquaries, embroidered vestments, imported spices, and expensive horses. Linen burial cloths rarely impressed anyone enough to deserve lengthy description, precisely because so many respectable travelers possessed one. Their ordinary nature concealed extraordinary meaning. Inside the guest hall, the travelers found long wooden tables already crowded with other visitors. Some were merchants returning from fairs. Others were students heading toward cathedral schools. A few wore the distinctive scallop shells identifying pilgrims who had traveled astonishing distances toward famous shrines. Several looked so exhausted that conversation surrendered to chewing with admirable determination. Meals within monasteries differed noticeably from meals inside roadside inns. They tended toward simplicity rather than entertainment. Thick vegetable pottage, coarse bread beans, onions, cheese, watered ale, and occasionally fish formed the backbone of hospitality. Luxury rarely appeared. Predictability did. After days of uncertain provisions, predictable food became its own kind of miracle. The kindly monk responsible for guests moved quietly through the hall, observing each traveler without appearing intrusive. He noticed swollen ankles before complaints emerged. He recognized fever from flushed cheeks. He watched breathing patterns. Medieval monks accumulated considerable practical medical experience simply because travelers constantly arrived, carrying every illness Europe could invent. When he reached the young merchant introduced earlier in our journey, his eyes briefly settled upon the folded linen resting beside the satchel. "You've prepared wisely," my mother insisted. "Then she loves you very much." The merchant laughed softly. She said precisely the same thing. The monk nodded. Mothers usually do. No further explanation proved necessary. Modern readers may find this exchange almost painfully understated. Surely conversations about one's own burial cloth should involve dramatic speeches concerning mortality. Medieval people often disappointed such expectations. They treated death with startling familiarity precisely because it occupied everyday experience. Children saw funerals regularly. Epidemics returned repeatedly. Childbirth remained dangerous. Harvest failures produced hunger. Roads claimed lives through accidents and violence. Death had never agreed to remain politely hidden behind hospital curtains. The burial cloth therefore represented preparation rather than pessimism. Religious teaching reinforced this emotional balance through the medieval concept known as memento mori, the reminder that every Christian should remember death not as obsession, but as spiritual orientation. Sermons encourage believers to live well because earthly existence remained temporary. Monastic writers repeatedly describe life as pilgrimage toward eternity. Travelers carrying burial shrouds simply transform metaphor into practical luggage. One surviving monastic collection from the 12th century includes advice offered to guest masters responsible for receiving travelers. They were instructed to observe visitors carefully because illness often appeared after long journeys. Guests requiring confession should receive priests promptly. Those dying should not remain abandoned among strangers. The text reveals remarkable administrative concern for spiritual as well as physical welfare. Hospitality extended beyond supper. Imagine arriving after weeks upon dangerous roads, knowing that if fever suddenly overwhelmed you, complete strangers already understood the procedures necessary to preserve both dignity and salvation. That quiet certainty eased fears modern transportation rarely asks us to confront. Of course, monasteries did not possess unlimited resources. During busy pilgrimage seasons, guest halls overflowed. Wealthier travelers sometimes offered donations supporting future hospitality. Poor pilgrims relied entirely upon charity. Monasteries constantly balanced generosity against finite supplies of bread ale, firewood, blankets, and patience. Even saints occasionally confronted accounting problems. Records from several Benedictine houses reveal surprisingly detailed lists calculating annual bread consumption for guests. Hospitality required planning. Every unexpected traveler consumed grain harvested months earlier. Behind every charitable meal stood countless farmers, millers, bakers, cellarers, gardeners, brewers, and lay brothers whose quiet labor transformed theology into soup. The apprentice eventually asked the monk a question that had lingered since leaving the forest. If someone dies here, what happens to the burial cloth? The monk answered without hesitation. If family can be found, it returns with them. And if no family comes, then it serves its purpose. Nothing more. What more should it do? Again, modern expectations seek emotional spectacle, while medieval practice preferred gentle practicality. The cloth became the first clean garment offered to the deceased. Bodies were washed whenever circumstances allowed. Hands folded, eyes closed, prayers spoken. Burial followed according to Christian custom. The cloth traveled precisely so these simple mercies remained possible. Perhaps, surprisingly, monasteries occasionally accumulated collections of unidentified possessions left behind by travelers who never resumed their journeys. Wills, prayer books, walking staffs, knives, purses containing modest coins, clothing, and sometimes burial linens required careful handling. Canon law and local custom attempted to determine ownership whenever possible. Monks effectively became temporary custodians of interrupted lives. Archaeology quietly supports these written records. Excavations near medieval hospitals and monastic burial grounds have uncovered graves whose careful wrapping indicates prepared linen rather than improvised coverings. Although archaeology cannot always identify whether travelers supplied these cloths, personally combined evidence from documents and surviving customs paints an increasingly persuasive picture. The experienced pilgrim leaned closer toward the apprentice as candles flickered across the dining hall. Earlier you asked why people carried burial cloths. I did. Now ask a different question. What question? Why did monasteries care so much? The apprentice frowned thoughtfully. Because they believed every traveler deserved dignity. Good. And because every stranger might become their brother in Christ. Better. And because someday they might be the traveler instead. The older man smiled. Best. Medieval hospitality functioned through remarkable psychological symmetry. Today's host became tomorrow's traveler. Today's healthy merchant became tomorrow's fever patient. Today's monastery receiving strangers might someday send monks across equally dangerous roads. Compassion therefore rested not only upon abstract morality, but upon realistic imagination. One unusually moving account survives from an English monastery, describing the death of an unknown traveler who arrived exhausted during winter. The record preserves frustratingly few personal details. His name remained uncertain. His birthplace unknown. His family absent. Yet monks carefully noted that he confessed, received final prayers, and received burial according to Christian custom. In historical terms, he almost disappeared. In spiritual terms, they refused to allow disappearance. Anonymous humanity still deserves ceremony. This distinction mattered enormously. Throughout history, countless civilizations struggled with one haunting question. What obligations exist toward strangers who die far from home? Some ignored them, some robbed them, some feared them. Medieval Christian Europe, despite countless imperfections elsewhere, developed surprisingly organized answers through parish systems, monasteries, hospitals, guilds, confraternities, and local communities. The burial cloth represented only one thread within that larger fabric. Dry humor occasionally surfaced even here. Medieval miracle collections preserve curious stories involving travelers who stubbornly survived situations everyone considered fatal. One account describes companions already discussing burial arrangements before the supposedly dying man abruptly recovered enough to complain about their pessimism. Human beings have apparently enjoyed embarrassing premature funeral planners for many centuries. The goose, had one been present, would almost certainly have objected to becoming part of the medical consultation. As darkness settled completely outside, bells announced evening prayers. Some travelers attended willingly. Others remained too exhausted even for devotion. No one appeared scandalized. God the monk suspected understood blisters. The young merchant unfolded his mother's carefully packed linen before sleeping, inspecting it under candlelight. The stitching remained firm, corners neatly hemmed. No ornament decorated its surface beyond quiet craftsmanship. Earlier that morning it had seemed almost embarrassing to carry. Now surrounded by dozens of similar bundles resting beside equally ordinary travelers, it no longer felt strange. Instead, it revealed membership within an invisible community stretching across Europe. Pilgrims, merchants, students, craftsmen, widows, messengers, monks. Everyone journeyed beneath the same uncertain sky. Everyone hoped to reach tomorrow. Everyone nevertheless carried some quiet acknowledgement that tomorrow belonged finally to God. Outside the monastery walls, wind moved gently through the surrounding trees. Somewhere beyond those forests lay roads, still filled with travelers who had not yet found shelter before nightfall. Some would reach villages, others isolated farmhouses. A fortunate few might discover another monastery before darkness deepened completely. Each continued walking beside the same unseen companion that medieval people accepted with surprising serenity. Death had never promised appointments. Preparation, therefore, became ordinary wisdom rather than extraordinary fear. And as candles slowly shortened beside sleeping strangers, the monastery itself became something more than stone buildings upon a hillside. It became a pause between departures, a fragile island of warmth inside an unpredictable landscape, where folded linen resting beside weary heads quietly reminded everyone that compassion often begins long before it is actually needed.